All right, so last week we went into, or 2 weeks ago, because we had the singing last week, was verses 1 through 16. And, excuse me, sorry. All right, so that was kind of an introductory class to why he wrote the book, the reason that he wrote, the hopes that he had for visiting them, and why he was not ashamed of the gospel, why he was eager to go out and speak the gospel even to them. So in your opinion, it's kind of a review. Let's think about what is the most important idea that's present in those first 17 verses. I know this is an opinion verse, but our opinion question. What do you say was the most important idea? 16? That's pretty logical because basically it summarizes the entire book. I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it's the power of God to salvation for everyone who believes, to the Jew first, also for the Greek. I think it's a good place to put it. It might be number one. And in the section here, it also relates to the reason that he was wanting to go there to preach to them to begin with. What was the main reason he wanted to be able to see the Christians there? Right, to impart spiritual gifts to them, right, so that they could be established. In verse 11, I may impart some spiritual gift so that you may be established, and that he meant by that encouraged together with him. They'd all be encouraged from their mutual faith. Now, we talked about this too. He already recognizes that they had a great faith. Look in verse 8, right? He recognized that they had a faith that was spoken throughout the world, so they had been there for a little while, long enough to actually send people out, and whether they had an organized system of sending them out or they just simply people moved away from there and took the gospel with them, like we see with Ananias and Sapphira, whatever the case, that is part of it. Now we know that later on, that before this was written, there was that one time where one of the, I almost said pharaohs, the emperors actually kicked all the Christians out of Rome, and so that could have been the time frame when they actually spread the gospel and people was aware of the church, but somehow they existed there also in Rome at this time. So that was only a short-lived edict, and they went back to their homes, evidently. Why was it so important that the Christians received the miraculous gifts if they were already so actively faithful that everyone recognized their faithfulness? Yeah, right. It implies that they didn't have everything yet. Yeah, so they needed it all, and this is part of the process. And then why aren't we in similar danger? That's already answered right there, because we have this, right? So everything that the Holy Spirit gave to all the apostles and prophets in the first century, we have it here. And in essence. Now, there may have been some things that one prophet would have said, but what happens is one prophet will say something, and if it's included in the rest of the pages of the Scripture, there's not a single book for every single prophet that ever lived in the first century. There were probably a lot of them. But the information that they were giving is the same information we receive in these books, and that's one of the reasons that it's so wonderful that the Holy Spirit had Paul and Peter and James and Jude and other people writing these letters. So we have access to what they had back then, and we have the complete revelation. All right, very good, very good. So let's look in verses 18 through 32. And he says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness and the lust of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, worship and serve the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to vile passions. Even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise, also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another. Men with men committing what is shameful and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error, which was due. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. All right, so quite a bit here, but we're going to kind of go through an overview of this section 18 through 32. Yes. Chapter 1. Romans. Yeah. And by the way, there are handouts in the back as you walk in. But you wouldn't have known. You have to look for it, that's right. It probably says this Sunday on it instead of today, but anyway. All right, let's see. So God revealed the righteousness of God by the gospel. That's what verse 17 says. For in it, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. We talked about that quite a bit. He also revealed his wrath in verse 18, and that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Now, the wrath is revealed, like I said, is revealed against ungodliness and unrighteousness. And he even says that living in ungodliness and unrighteousness suppresses truth, because that's what he says at the end of that verse. Who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because of it's not that they were unrighteously suppressing the truth, it was their behavior was suppressing the truth. It was preventing truth from being spread, and many reasons could be applied to that. It could be that they were actively engaged in trying to suppress it, but it also implies that they were engaged in the suppression of that truth simply because of their behavior, because you're generally going to believe the things that you do, right? So you think you're living in the best way possible. Most of us do. Okay, so notice here some points in this section. We'll get into the questions in a minute. He says, what may be known of God is manifest in them by God. All right, that's going to be in verse 19. What may be known of God is manifest in them. All right, does anyone have a different word for manifest? Has made known. It's plain. Yeah, so I looked up the word manifest, and that's exactly what it means. It's plain to the eye, or it's plain to reason. It's obvious. So this is not something where he's saying, yeah, they have it there if they want to cipher all the codes and figure out all the, things, the ways that they can do it, then they can figure out that God exists. He says, what may be known of God is evident. It's clear in them. It's inside of them, right? So this suggests that God has put it in us innately that we would recognize God. And, history teaches us that, doesn't it? You know how many societies there have been that were purely atheist, that didn't believe in God? No, none of the people did? There's not any. You know that the most common stance in relation to God is what? He exists. Sorry? Yeah, it's in all societies, that's right. Even though they may be myths, they're still there. But as a whole, it's been 99 percentile of humanity from the very beginning has always believed in God. And that's not coincidental. How can you have that many? Is there anything else the majority, vast majority of humans actually believe in. I mean, think about that. There may be some other things that we all believe in, but we believe in that. And so there's some evidence of that God actually created us to be that way. It's evident. And you have to have some reasoning ability, sure, but it's still there. Well, yeah. There are a lot of creation myths, and they kind of take here and there from what the Bible teaches, and then some of them just disregard the Bible altogether. But the only accurate information we have is right here, for sure. Yeah. When he created it all, yeah. Yeah, so, there's been lately a handful of what we would call radical atheists who they've been written bold books, they've been writing all kinds of things, usually writings and debates and things like this. And so they get out there and they mock God and they dare to say terrible blasphemous things about him. And I think part of that is to show that we're not afraid to say God doesn't exist. How can we possibly believe? And the impression that you get from listening to them is that, I mean, all scientists don't believe that there's no such thing as God. Just like all scientists believe in in evolution and things like this. And anytime you have a scientist saying that all scientists believe something, then you better look into it a little bit more deeply, right? Because there's no way all scientists agree on anything, but yeah, right. Or it's 99% of all scientists. Now I agree that there are a lot of scientists who reject God, but there are lots and lots of scientists who also accept God and believe in him in one way or another. Yeah. Yeah, it may be half and half, yeah. So anyway, it's evident. So what they have to argue against is not some logical proofs that humans have created to try to prove that God exists. They've got to argue with themselves and what's inside of them that they know better, so they find ways to suppress it. That's the interpretation I would get in applying this. But notice what he says. The point is not to prove that God exists. The point is he's saying it's evident. And then it says that people rejected him despite that knowledge. So that's the point that he's really wanting them to know. God has, in fact, in verse 19, it says, "For God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened." So there's a rejection process there because of, there are many reasons that people don't want to believe in God, but it says that they became futile in their thoughts and their thinking, and that they changed God into an image, right? So in verse 23, they changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. So when they started looking at God and trying to define him and describe him and creating an idol that represents him, that's why Israel was not allowed to have those things. They were not allowed to have images of God. And the implied idea there is that they weren't allowed to take something and worship it as if it's God. Because whatever you create as a representation of God is already limited, because God is greater than any of those things. You cannot fathom God into a thing, right? So they rejected him, and despite this knowledge, and they became futile in their thinking. All right. So what does futile mean? Let me see if I can find the verse so you can see the same thing. You can look it up in yours. Verse 21, they became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. What does futile mean? Vain. Right. The English dictionary that I looked up said that it meant unable to present anything of fact or value. Useless. And so their brains, their minds became useless. And vain would be part of that too, right? Wouldn't that be the same idea? What did Solomon say about the futility of life? It's all vanity. So it's futile. The futility comes in. It doesn't mean that they're stupid, because they're still reasoning, but the whole basis of the reasoning is off, right? So since we're picking on scientists, what is the basis of the scientific theory related to how people come to the idea of knowledge? What's the basis of that? You know? I may be phrasing it wrong. Yeah, through the five senses. So anything that we can test. And that means everything that supposedly they're basing all of their theories and things on is the assumption that this physical universe is the only thing that exists. And because it's the only thing that exists, we can use the information we get from this universe to explain everything in the universe. Well, that's a completely different subject, but that's futile thinking, because very limited. Yeah. Can you make an argument of so we're testing in a test tube, and I'm going to make an argument that will teach me how to please God? There's no way you can do that. So you can't test the spiritual realm and the physical realm. So that's why it's futile. And we don't have to be a scientist to be that way. We can think worldly thoughts and get caught up in those worldly things, which is what he says. And then it says that God delivered them to their sins that they were searching for. In fact, he says that a couple times. Now the word, I looked it up, and the word is delivered. It wasn't cast out so that they would go find their own sins. It wasn't kicked out of the house. It was, the idea of delivery is like when you order a pizza, right? The pizza store makes it, they put it in the hands of a deliverer, and he walks it to your front door and knocks on the door, and he delivers it to you straight into your hands. That's a delivery. That's what God did. And it says it in a couple of times on there. So that's important to recognize, that you delivered them to their sins, the things that they were looking for. And of course, the result is, verse 32, that it is spiritual death, that God had. They know the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death. And they still do it, and they still approve of other people who do it. One of the challenging things we face in the world is we have people who are caught up in sin who want us to not only allow them to do it, but to approve of them doing it. And we really can't do that, right? This is what he's talking about. They approve of those people who practice them. So there's a big difference between supporting a person and supporting their sin. And you can support someone, you can be loving and compassionate to people without supporting the sin that they're in. And so, but we have to find a line there. We have to draw the line sometimes. Where is that? It's not always easy to see the line. But anyway, these are the things he's talking about here in this section. Okay, let's look at the verses here. Anybody have any comments about that before we go into the questions? Paul said in verse 18, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. Now, what does he say in verse 19 as the reason that this wrath is revealed? Gives us an indication of that. Yeah. Yes. Exactly. In fact, the first couple verses here is kind of a summary of the rest of the chapter. It just tells you, it explains in more detail how it could be that God could be righteous in punishing people. Yeah, Sodom and Gomorrah's example. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. Some people have kind of asked the question about judgment or hell, and they've kind of implied in the question, how could God create a bunch of people and then punish them for doing things they didn't know they shouldn't do? Well, Paul's addressing that. They did know. It's what's evident should be within us. And I was talking to somebody about this earlier today. There is a point at which we have to be given information in order to understand what God expects. But there's also a point at which we know some things innately. We know that it's wrong to kill people or to murder people. There are a lot of things that we just know by it's instinct. And the reason we know that is because you can look all around the world and see people have the same morality, mostly the same morality as far as that's concerned. Even people who are cannibalistic, who kill people and murder and eat them, still know that in some context they can't do that. Yeah, Joe? Mm-hmm. Yeah, there have been people all throughout history who have understood, and we have wise sages because they understood, and everyone else did too, to some degree, right? Gotcha. That's what he was thinking. For Cicero? I didn't know that. So, okay, think about the next question, though. He says, how did he manifest himself? He said he's manifest himself to them. How does God manifest himself in the hearts or inside people? Okay, that's one part of that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so verse 20, he actually answers that, doesn't he? Since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are seen. We see his invisible attributes. That's one of the greatest arguments we have. I mean, look around. The more we study biology and any of the science fields, the more we study it, the more you have to recognize how incredibly complex and beautiful this thing is. And it's amazing how, I can't remember who said it. Joe will tell me. Said a little bit of science will make you an atheist, and a lot of science will make you a believer. And the more you study into it, the more you have to deny a lot of things to make it feel like if you don't want to believe in God, you got to deny a lot of stuff.
seeking God. But look at what happened when the woman touched the hem of Jesus' garment.
Mhm.
That quick, that he understood, he knew, he felt it. So why wouldn't he be able to hone in and receive a person who is truly seeking him?
I believe that he has a way of giving us the information that we need, getting it to us. I don't have any doubt in that at all. That's why people ask me, what about people who've never heard? If you want to find God, he will help you find him. Jesus said, if you will seek, you'll find, right? I have no doubt in that. I don't believe in that he's doing miracles or anything like that, but I believe that if you want to find out, you will. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure it happens a lot because if like we said, God works through providence, through all kinds of wonderful things that he does. So part of this also, though, would you say it relates to the society that we're around? I mean, there's so many factors, and if everyone around you believes in God, it's a lot more likely that you're going to believe in him too. There's many things probably that we can relate to that how he can show himself to be real. Yeah. Yep. You don't believe in coincidences? All right, so look at verse 21. It says, although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful. What does it mean to not glorify him as God? In the practical sense of what we're talking about in this section, what does it mean to not glorify him? Okay, I would think that would relate to being thankful, but there's more to it than just that. But I would agree it is a part of that. Yeah, somebody had something. No acknowledgement or honor. Okay, how do we honor God? We recognize his authority, right? We recognize who he is, and that if you recognize there is a God, why is it that that's such a problem with people in the science realm? They want to pretend that it's because the evidence doesn't support it, but that's not true. Why do they not want to follow God or have a God? They're going to be held accountable. Yes. So it's automatic. If you recognize there being higher than you, you have to ask the question, what does he expect from me? And that has to be part of the question, part of the situation here. So not glorifying him as God is not living in any way and trying to be pleasing to him. And then what does he mean? How does failing to glorify God or not being thankful, how does that cause corruption? How does not glorifying God or not being thankful to God, how does that cause corruption? You go your own direction. Yeah, exactly. So you're already corrupted because you're not recognizing that there is a pattern or there is a responsibility, and now you're on your own. So that's already corruption. Okay, we already answered number 4. How does thankfulness relate to corruption? Or let's put it another way. How does thankfulness relate to avoiding corruption? Yeah. All right. Yeah, that would definitely lead to corruption. So in being thankful to God means that we're recognizing we're going to give him honor for what for what is actually his responsibility. It reinforces the fact that we're submissive to him, that we are relying on him, right? And because of this, it's really interesting to me that one of the things he said is a lack of faithfulness is what led to this corruption. And you don't have to be an atheist to be unappreciative, right? So there's at least 2 parts to appreciation. The first one is a recognition, and the second one is appropriate praise. If you wanted to see a third one, it would be a change in behavior, but that's getting into more irreverence. But a recognition of what God has done is vital, but we may recognize it and never even be thankful for it. So if you recognize what he did and you bow your head and say, well, it's God's fault, I'm going through this. Anybody ever said that before? I've heard a lot of people say this. I can't believe God's put me through this again. It's a recognition, but is it thankful? Oh, yeah. That's a hard one, to be thankful for what God has done for you, to recognize and to appreciate what actually we have. It's not always easy, and I'm not saying that it's only related to bad things, but sometimes we see good things and don't even give appreciation for that. Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm. Right. Purity. Yeah. You can even see that in the garden. It's not that they didn't that they complained necessarily, but she started thinking, "Wait a minute, he's keeping something from me, right?" So there's a distrust that starts to build into that relationship, and complaining does corrupt that. Even I saw somebody else's hand. Oh, Joe.
It's not any of my doing. It's truly a gift from God because for whatever reason he chose to give me a fair amount of athletic ability. And that's what makes me such a good fighter. Okay? And the athletic ability I was born with, if you're born with something, that's truly a gift from God.
Oh, yeah, it's kind of, yeah.
You can look at it any other way.
All right, yeah, true. It says that God delivered them over to uncleanness in verse 24. Mine says God also gave them up to uncleanness, but the word is delivered to uncleanness. Gave them up, that's why I looked it up, because gave them up kind of sounds like he just tossed them out. But he didn't. It doesn't actually say that. It says he delivered them to uncleanness. Yeah, hand over, deliver, and to give them up. So why would God hand over people to such a lifestyle? He's just, okay, here you go. I'm not sure who was talking first. Go ahead.
When they dishonor the Godhead by changing what he made them to be, just like that animal, and they changed the idea of It dishonored him to start off with. They wouldn't listen. What else did he do?
That's right. So this is a hard lesson to learn, to accept sometimes. God will let you believe whatever you want. And if you want to believe in falsehood, he'll let you. He'll even help you if you want to bad enough. But I think that part of that shows, it implies that God he wants Christians to come to him because they want to be there, right? And we have that freedom of choice that he's given to us. And sometimes, this is also, Paul said that of Hymenaeus and Alexander, I think, that he handed him over to Satan. It's the same idea. That he just, here you go, package delivery right here. And we know it's symbolic. He didn't literally do that, but that is a reference to, he's saying, we just washed our hands of them. We just sent them on their way and said, you're done with us. Why? Hopefully, sometimes people have to hit bottom before they start looking for the top, right? And sometimes they got to do that. The prodigal son was an example of that too, right? He hit bottom. Huh? Nebuchadnezzar? Yeah, definitely, with going crazy for however long he did, 7 years or whatever. Very good. In verse 26, he also says he gave them up. What is the difference between the things he handed them over to in those two verses? In the first one, in verse, where was it? Verse 24, they're dishonoring their bodies among themselves. And then verse 26, he gave them up to vile passions, right? It's really the same things. Is there another use of this? I thought also he gave them up to the worshiping of the false gods. Mm-hmm. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Oh, God gave them over to debased mind to do those things which are not fitting. Right. Because they didn't like to retain God in their thoughts, so God gave them up. And thank you. But look at, look in verse 29. Being filled with unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness. Here's a whole list of things. It's not just worshiping false gods and homosexuality he's talking about here. He's talking about all sin, right? So, go ahead. No. Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. Look at what he says in verse 28. He gave them over to mine says a debased mind. Does anyone have a different translation? Depraved. All right, what does that mean? Sorry? Reprobate. What do those words mean? Yeah. It actually is in the book of James, he talks about how that if you live by faith, you will be an approved servant. This is that word, but it's the opposite. It's unapproved. That's literally what it's talking about. Yeah. So it's not what it should be. It's not functioning appropriately. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. So he mentions a lot of sins here, and we have a tendency to say sin is sin, and I agree 100%. Any one of these sins will keep you out of heaven if you're not forgiven. Why does he spend so much time talking about homosexuality and talking about the other one with false gods? Yeah.
Paul addresses that, I don't know if it's here, but he says why God considers homosexuality an abomination because you're going against God and nature.
Okay.
So you're not saying it's unnatural, so it's unnatural on several different elements. And those are the reasons why Paul ends up saying eventually is like, yeah, you're going against the order of God and the order of nature to follow after your own self.
Yeah, I can see that. I think that. Okay, go ahead, Adam. Okay, you made me wrong. Yeah, that is something for sure. Yeah. All right, I can see that. Right. Joe? Yeah, it wasn't anything to them.
And I mentioned Cicero, being a believer in the one true God. The majority of them didn't believe it.
Oh yeah, vast majority. Well, yeah, it seems to me that he's also talking about extremes. So in order to talk about how bad things are, you talk about the extreme of it. And this seems to be at a point where society starts to unravel. When you have corruption of human hearts to this excess of idolatry and homosexuality and all the things there, it's not that those things are inherently worse, it's that those things are representative of so many other things that are a problem in society that have been, so many people have had a debased mind. Do you have a debased mind if you're a backbiter? Yeah, you have a reprobate mind. It's not any different, but it's a symptom of a decay that has really manifested itself in society. And that's one of the concerns I have right now for this country, to be honest with you. All right, well, that was the last bell. Thank you all for your comments. And there's stuff on the back if you want to go through it in your own study. It's hopefully help you work through some of the questions here. Thank you very much.